Yeah, as one of my three very wise supervisors told me at the very outset of the whole PhD process, he said very wisely, the point of the PhD is not to make the research, it's to make the scholar. Yeah.
So let's what would you rather uh talk about first? You want to talk about your podcast first? You want to talk about your dissertation work first?
I think seeing as it leads nicely on, I'd love to talk about the dissertation. I haven't
Sure.
actually spoken about it to really to anyone. So it's still pretty fresh in my head. For context, I submitted about a month ago now.
Mhm.
And yeah, it's still weighing on my mind, so I'm more than happy to talk about that.
That sounds great. Well, would you give us a précis of it? And again, if you want to share anything, you are a co-host, so you are welcome to share anything that you would like.
Gladly. Yeah, I can try and share the thing itself. Which it's a mighty document. There are many reasons, not just quality for its length. It was also the quantity of stuff that I had to get through. But if I could, how would I do this? Uh, um, I think you can.
And
There's
it
nothing.
is publicly available one way or another, right? Because you sent me a link.
Yeah, it will be publicly available as well.
Will
Currently, people
okay.
have access to it if I send them the invite, but I can
Okay.
share it and then yeah, then I can dive into what this actually means.
I,
Um,
I was just thinking quickly, like, is there a copyright issue with it right now, or some kind of confidentiality issue with the actual document itself right now?
it's a good point, but no, frankly, not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Not I can't foresee any problems. But yes, so here's the document, here's the beginning of it. So the title is Reconstructing the Left Peripheries of Proto-Indo-European. So I kept it, short and snappy for the title. Submitted to the University of Edinburgh, which is my university, has been for 3 years now. And for context as well, for comparison with you, Jackson, British PhDs tend to be a lot shorter than American PhDs. So 3 years, 3.5 years is actually quite normal. If people were wondering, that's not enough time. But yeah, you dive into it. But a really nice thing, I mentioned Edinburgh. A really nice thing is that because Edinburgh is extremely passionate about public outreach, so sharing the knowledge that the university generates with a wider non-specialist audience, it's actually included in the rules of submission that you have to include a summary for non-specialists, which I really like. So you
I
have
do
the
too.
abstract, which is very typical. The abstract, which is written in fairly, standard academies. But whereas the lay summary was then my chance to take a step back and say, how would I explain it to somebody, like the rest of my family, for example? I come from a long line of non-linguists. So it's very good for me to write this piece. So yeah, I mean, I won't read it, the whole thing because that would take too long. But um, essentially, this is a PhD in historical syntax. So historical syntax, deconstructing that two-word term, it's word order through time. Essentially, languages have word order in general. We have these kind of abstract rules that govern in some languages more strictly than others, but that they kind of determine in what order our bits of vocabulary go. So obviously that's we say words. That's a very weird term. Linguists aren't entirely sure what a word is, but words, affixes as well can be they come within the remit of syntax, and more specifically, the whole PhD was to explore the question of what can we say about the word order of a prehistoric language, a language for which we do not have written evidence. It predates the written record. It's too old to have been written down. More specifically still, a particular prehistoric language, arguably the most famous prehistoric language out there, which is Proto-Indo-European. So that's the ancestor language of this huge spread of languages across Eurasia originally, and then in the modern era, the across the Americas as well. It includes languages like English, like Persian, like French, like Old Norse, like Old Irish, which quickly became my favorite over the course of researching this. So what can we say about the word order of this prehistoric language? More specifically still, and then I'll shut up, it's too much to study the whole word order of a language. I think that's enough for one career, let alone one PhD, one 3-year PhD. So it's specifically the left peripheries, which is a metaphor. This is a term that we use in syntax. It's taken from, well, it's really taken from European writing systems where you read from left to right. The left periphery essentially means the beginning. It means the beginning of a clause. So a clause is something like the cat sat on the mat, and the noun phrase. The noun phrase built around nouns, so something like the big blue cat. Cats don't tend to be blue, but anyway, you get the point. So what tends to come at the beginning of those two syntactic units, the clause and the noun phrase, in Proto-Indo-European? So that, in a nutshell, is what I think you need to know to start this conversation off. Did that all make sense?
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah.
And anyone who wants further clarification, of course, go into the chat. So
Please do.
How did you go about this study?
Yes. So this is very much a research-based PhD, a research in the sense of using secondary sources. There are many ways in which we can go about researching languages. Obviously, you can use statistics to talk about what is normal in word order, what is a kind of a basic word order, what is an unusual word order. That's not me, I have to say. While I've done my best to get up to speed with the statistical studies, this whole thesis stands on the shoulders of giants, of other scholars who are themselves standing on the shoulders of other linguists who are themselves standing on the shoulders of, well, I guess, archivists and archaeologists all the way down. So really, it was a case of working through the previous literature concerning a set of Indo-European languages. There's this discrete set that my supervisors and I agreed on at the very beginning. It was very specific kind of criteria for the languages that I was going to study in order to talk about Proto-Indo-European. The reason, or the criteria, was that they had to be old. So that's the kind of principle: is the older the language is, the closer it is to its prehistoric ancestor. So French, fine; Latin, better; or modern Greek, fine; ancient Greek, much better. And they had to be a wide distribution, so that they are spread across the kind of traditional sub-branches of Indo-European. For that reason, I chose languages like Latin, ancient Greek, Vedic Sanskrit, Old Norse, Old English, Old Irish, and I've forgotten one, Old Church Slavonic. These are, I should stress, not contemporary languages. They are, they differ wildly, but for the distribution, I had to go with a kind of a, there's like 5,000 years difference, I think, or something between the oldest and the youngest. But still, for the good distribution, I had to, go with that group. And the reason why you need this set is because getting back to prehistoric languages for which we have no evidence, is traditionally done through something called the comparative method. So that's, as the name suggests, taking a group of languages, looking at the ways in which they are alike, we're looking at the ways, crucially, in which they correspond to one another, and saying off the basis of these correspondences, well, they're appearing so strongly, these aren't loan words, this isn't contact influence, this isn't coincidence, these are legacies of the prehistoric language for which we have no evidence. So it's using the historical to get back to the prehistorical.
Mhm.
This, I mean, this is not a new idea. I cannot claim responsibility for any of these ideas, the methodology. This is really old. This goes back to sort of the end of the 18th century. It kind of has a big heyday in the 19th century. But crucially, through all of those kind of 200 years of which when people are using the comparative method to get back to prehistoric languages, they're doing it with sounds and vocabulary. So you might know a famous thing like Grimm's Law, for example. Grimm's Law concerns Germanic languages. You've got things like a p becoming a f in Germanic, so English father, Latin pater, ancient Greek pater, Sanskrit pitar. And really, it's good. Like it works. It's basically uncontroversial now, and it's upon this pretty sturdy rock that the whole idea of Indo-European has been, proposed. And I think, with the exception of people who tend to have a kind of political axe to grind, Proto-Indo-European as a thing is pretty well accepted today. But what about word order? Like
Mhm.
we've got some sounds, and we've arranged those sounds into strings of sounds, i.e., words, and paired them with a meaning. How then did speakers of Proto-Indo-European, I use that term, loosely, but in whatever state this ancient language actually existed, how did they string those words into sentences? What was their word order, essentially? And this, I will say, is very much an ongoing project. This is controversial because some people have said we can't know, just not possible. And me, my future Viva examiner, and a couple of our friends, like I said, it's a close-knit group. There's dozens of us, dozens. We think it is actually possible that you can make claims about prehistoric word order that are as not correct or true, but as cogent, as convincing as the claims that we make about the sounds and the vocabulary of Proto-Indo-European. So that's it. That's the elevator pitch. Sorry, I'm British. Lift pitch. Yeah.
All right. And so what kind of conclusions were you able to draw?
Yeah. So I suppose I think the very general the biggest conclusion, the macro conclusion that I would want to emphasize is that we should think of Proto-Indo-European as a language with syntax, as in it had abstract rules that the speakers were acquiring as children, and were applying, and they were slotting their bits of vocabulary into abstract patterns, i.e. syntax, what we call syntax. That might sound quite dry, but that kind of big conclusion is very much in response to the idea that the reasonable conclusion, if you look at, say, Latin, ancient Greek, especially Sanskrit, it looks like word order anarchy. So you could possibly draw the conclusion based on that Proto-Indo-European had no word order. There was no syntax. You could put any word in any order, so long as it was a properly formed word, so long as you had the affixes at the end. If it was a verb, it had inflection. If it was a noun, it had declension. But otherwise, you could just put anything in any particular order. And I would very much like to push back on that. I think we can explain so much of what we find across in ancient Indo-European, historical Indo-European languages, if we presume that they come from an ancestor that had syntax. But otherwise, it just so many little features, smaller details that I've concluded become harder to explain. Like it becomes like, okay, fine, the ancestor didn't have syntactic constraints, syntactic laws, rules. Well, Latin clearly has them. They're not as strong as perhaps, say, French, but they're there in Latin. So I think that would be the takeaway point that the noun phrase and the clause had syntax. And I'm very happy to elaborate on what that syntax looked like, but that's the takeaway point.
And I think you're right about that. I mean, if you find yourself in a position to teach one of these old Indo-European languages, um, as I have with this Old Norse class, for example, the two things that I think most rattle the nerves of people who don't have previous experience with such language is A, all of the different endings, and then B, as you said, the apparent anarchy of word order. And
Mm.
certainly from a modern English perspective, something like Old Norse, something like Latin, does have kind of anarchic word order. But um, if you spend some time inhabiting these languages, reading them frequently, maybe even notating, as you do, some particular aspects of what comes before and after what, um, you find that there is some order behind the apparent chaos, that there is a net, as it were. The net isn't as tight,
Mm.
but there is a net. Um, and of course, whatever the exact shape of that net is, as you pointed out, also, the earlier the language, the more likely that you're looking at some inherited features of that net.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I really like that metaphor. I really like that. I wish I'd written that. The net is perfect. Yeah, it's loose, but it's there, and you get you can't do the kind of syntactic research that we can do today with speakers who are still alive, but you do over time pick up a sense of grammaticality, of like
Mhm.
boundaries in which the speakers would just not cross. And I think in some cases there are many reasons for why that may have been, but I think in some cases these are, I can think of no better word than syntactic. So for example, if I can be a bit more specific, one of the kind of conclusions is that I think that one of the pretty safe bits of syntax that we can reconstruct is WH movement. So WH movement is essentially forming questions. So in English, for example, you could form a good question with the WH word. So that's, what, why, who, when. We tend to put it at the beginning. We call it movement because it kind of looks like it's moved, right? Normally in English, the object of the verb comes after the verb. So, you see the woman. But in a question, you put the object at the beginning. Who did you see? Or whom, if you're that way inclined. Whom did you see? Um, and this is, I mean, so consistent, not universal, but so consistent across the Indo-European languages. I mean, this is not something, even in Sanskrit, which looks like, it can look like word soup sometimes. Dealing with the Vedas, these extremely old texts among our oldest sources for Indo-European, even they show WH movement where they're putting the question words at the beginning, they're putting relative words at the beginning. So, the man who I see, the who is relative, it goes at the beginning of the relative clause. Sanskrit's doing that too. Like I said, not universal. I think this is something that emerges at a later point in the history of Proto-Indo-European than the earliest one that we can get back to, because there's the problem of Hittite. Hittite
Mhm.
is, as people may know, is a fascinating Indo-European language, which I didn't work on. Done my best to familiarize myself, but Hittite doesn't seem to show WH movement, which is, did they never have it? Did they lose it? It's fascinating, but I just simply said for a later stage of the ancestor language, I think, you know, all the kind of the principles that guide the reconstruction of sounds and of vocabulary. So these really well-established principles. Is it old? Is it the most frequent? Things like that. I think a kind of syntactic constraint like WH movement, like forming questions, it can be easily reconstructed, securely reconstructed back to some stage of Proto-Indo-European. So that would be one example of a bit of syntax that I think is really, really old.
Mhm. And of course, it's not a universal, as intuitive as it seems to speakers of Indo-European languages.
Yeah, absolutely not. I mean, arguably in Chinese doesn't have it. Arguably, kind of modern day colloquial French doesn't have it. Obviously you can say something like qu'est-ce que tu sais? What do you know? But you can also say tu sais quoi?
Mhm. Mhm.
It's it's which is kind of fine in English as well, but quite common in French these days. So yeah, it's not universal.
Yeah, and I feel like it is related in a way to the the classic topic comment structure, that you're signaling right away, here comes a question,
Yeah.
right? So topic information seeking
Yes.
is kind of what you're flagging at the very front there. And one thing that I was thinking about as you mentioned this, that the net is looser than in English, but still there, is that all languages have some kind of net this way, right? That you cannot have completely anarchic word order because
Yeah.
otherwise no one knows what you're talking about. Right? I mean, like it's a semi-obvious thing to say, but it's not a perfectly obvious thing to say that with there are bounds on this that are just the limitations of the human brain. If you can't have an adjective modifying a noun be,
Mm.
15 utterances later. It just doesn't make any sense.
No.
Um, but people will exaggerate these early Indo-European languages and make it sound like it's that way. Uh, like everyone's just going around talking like they're, I don't know, Virgil.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, that doesn't help that so many of our sources for these languages are poetry or they are metrical. So they are kind of working to set templates. But even still, I mean, that's where you really strike gold as a syntactician. That might sound, a bit counterintuitive that, you want to find the syntax of ancient Greek. How can you do that when you're studying something like Homer, where it's very much set according to these metrical templates, set according to a syllable weight. Um, isn't that useless? Well, no. Actually, it was a friend of mine who really hammered this point home to me. It's in those contexts, and when you still find syntactic constraints that you know that you're getting back to, you've reached the borders of grammaticality for Homer, whoever he or she or they was. You've actually struck kind of syntactic bedrock, and it's absolutely there in the Iliad and the Odyssey. For example, one of the things I absolutely concentrated on was subordinated. So words like because, while, since, as, that in English. These have been absolutely pivotal to my first chapter, which has the kind of catchy title of C in Proto-Indo-European. But that is like Homer really consistently puts subordinators first in their clause, occasionally second, occasionally followed by things that look kind of they may be emphatic. I think they're probably topical, but really, I think Homer's putting, they're in first or second position. That's syntax.
Mhm.
Likewise in the Rig Veda, things it's again annoying because subordinating conjunctions, these are European terms, Eurocentric terms, but they can't be applied easily to the Rig Vedas. But there are things that tell you the type of the clause, they're first or they're second. Like it's extremely consistent. That's syntax.
Mhm.
So I love those moments when you can actually kind of do great work with this. Sorry, I'm just
Well,
trying to
and
find. Yeah, there we go.
and I mean, further to your point about poetry still has to be intelligible to some member of the native speaking audience. It
Yeah,
cannot, it can play with norms, but it can't just utterly violate all the norms. So,
exactly. Yeah, and that is something I that was a kind of safety net of my safety, an intellectual safety net that I could say, you could spiral while researching the syntax of dead languages. You could kind of fall into philological pessimism and just say it's all useless. We can't use these sources. That's not true. Situate these sources in the context in which they were written. And you can reassure yourself that actually, yes, some of this is syntax that we are getting back to. That was, if I may, that safety net saved one language of the set that I studied, which was Old Church Slavonic.
hmm.
Old Church Slavonic for context. Old Church Slavonic is a Slavic language. It's the oldest Slavic language that we have evidence for. So it's dating from sort of like the 9th century onwards. And we have some texts, and they're good long texts, for getting stuck into, but they are clearly so heavily influenced by Greek
Hmm.
because they're all part of a particular point in time. You've got these two saints called Cyril or Constantine and Methodius. They're kind of preaching to the Slavs, trying to convert them to Christianity, and they're translating Greek texts to help them in their mission. And you could just dismiss Old Church Slavonic outright. You could just say, come on, this is not native Slavic word order. but still, like there are kind of two ways in which you can make headway with World Old Church Slavonic. One is that words that are enclitic, they are quite kind of particular in their position. So those that's definitely not a Greek influence. But more importantly, and more relevant to my point, Old Church Slavonic is it had to be understandable to the Slavs that they were trying to convert to Christianity. If you had these people come along, I mean, I think they would have been native Greek speakers, but they spoke Slavic extremely well. These two saints and their acolytes arriving in Greater Moravia, what's now Slovakia and the Czech Republic, and if they are just saying, "Yeah, we know your language, but the word order is just gibberish," they're not going to convert anybody.
Right.
So there's a safety net to doing research with that language, and that safety net is intelligibility. So, yeah, that's how I managed to say anything at all about Old Church Slavonic.
Well, and similar caveats apply to Gothic. People note all the time that Gothic word order looks so much like Greek. Well, still has to be intelligible. Would you take a couple of questions from the chat at this juncture?
Absolutely. Let me stop sharing my screen so I can see everybody.
Jay says, do vocabulary sounds and grammar and word order all change in concert among related languages, Germanic, Romance, etc., with the same readiness? If not, can you tell things about linguistic groups by the difference between their shared vocabulary versus syntax?
I forgot the high caliber of questions that you get in this. This is fantastic. Do vocabulary sounds in concert? I like that. That's a good question. I would say that the general consensus is that syntax is quite slow to change. If we are if I understand your question correctly, Jay, it's like if we imagine a kind of different components of a language, very crudely put, sounds, the phonology bit, the lexical bit, the grammar bit. I think that there's a kind of idea that syntax is quite reluctant to change, but it does change. It definitely does over time. I would say that it's really hard to speak accurately about this because I want to be cautious and I can't put like one syntactic constraint per generation. I can't put a speed on it, but I would say that the lexical, the lexical is definitely more open to change. So we can think of in our own lifetimes, new bits of vocabulary coming in. And if you take a step back as a historical linguist, you can say, well, that's change. That's change over time. They're taking these words in. The kind of sociological conditions are right for that to happen. But syntax it seems to be a bit slower. Some linguists even say that syntax is inert. It never changes, which I don't agree with, but I think it's a fascinating idea that the syntax changes really reluctantly. The rules of the language. It's only when, like, say, take the case of English. English over time goes from being fairly flexible in its word order to being a lot less flexible, modern English. And in the kind of transition from Old to Middle English, you do see there are other things going on, such as the endings. We're losing a lot of endings. We're losing, kind of that lack of grammatical information, things like case and lots of kind of verbal information. And the idea of syntactic inertia is that it's only because the phonology and morphology is just decaying that the syntax has to catch up. I think it's a really interesting idea, but I'm not sure. I think syntactic change does happen because of, yeah. What do you think,
Yeah.
Jackson?
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly counterindicated by something that's happening in English syntax right now,
Yeah.
right? Which is subject dropping in questions,
Mhm.
right? I mean, I think most of us it may actually be different in the UK versus in the US, but I think at least in the US, uh, your basic colloquial question is starting to not have a subject anymore. Heading
Yeah.
up the canyon, like that
Yeah.
coffee, driving this way, right? Like that, this is a fairly recent phenomenon,
Yeah.
but I feel like it's on the march, and I don't feel like that's triggered by any kind of morphological or phonological change. It's a purely syntactic change,
Yeah.
and you can't do it with um, statements. It's associated with the question domain, um, Because if you say the equivalent thing as a statement, it sounds quote unquote stupid,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Have a phone, talking
Yeah.
to Danny, right? But like that sounds dumb. But phrase it as a question. Have a phone,
Yeah.
talking to Danny. There you go. Right. So subject dropping in questions is happening right now.
Yeah.
I could see it becoming standard. It's already something that no one really blinks an eye at. But I don't think that 100 years ago it was normal at all, except in maybe very, very colloquial contexts.
Yeah.
And what's the phonological or morphological conditioner for that? Nothing has changed that I
I
can
wouldn't
think
say
of.
there is one. I could talk about kind of external things. I could talk about hazard a guess on something like typing, and so usage, language usage. But that would be going beyond of syntax. But I completely agree. And crucially, American children are hearing this.
Yeah.
This is their input, and they're learning this. They are, and so I think. I mean, syntax is really hard to predict. I do historical syntax, not futuristic syntax, but
Um,
I'd guess this is going to become, with each generation, less and less unusual, less and less kind of marked. When I say marked, that's a kind of very useful but strange linguistic term, meaning essentially it's a special word. It's going to become less special, and it's going to become normal, at a guess. Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah.
I think it already is. I think it's just no one has acknowledged it yet because no one writes that way formally. But
No.
it's already at the point where if you do have your subject in the question, it sounds formal.
Mm.
Do you have any, like it sounds
Yes.
already stuffy.
Do you have a phone? It just
Right.
sounds needlessly excessive. Yeah, exactly. I couldn't agree more. It's a really, really nice example. I will remember that one. And yeah, that's syntax in action. It just all it needs to be passed on to the next generation. And that was something, if I may, that was something that I'm so happy to get stuck into. I do feel that historical syntax specifically is in a really good place right now. Like I went to a conference last year. It's called DIGS, Diachronic Generative Syntax. It was in Paris. It was wonderful. And I just sat there pretty clueless because everybody was a lot more senior and more intelligent than me. But I just felt that people were going beyond the bounds of what syntax was a few years ago and really getting stuck into other factors that may influence this. And I mention this because I mention this because so that it's kind of suffused through a lot of the work, and I dare to think my own work is really getting into acquisition. So language acquisition, what is actually going on? I'm not saying we're right,
Right.
we syntacticians, because there are people who actually specialize in this, but it's in a healthy place, I think, in that I really, at least in the introduction to my thesis, tried to stress that, well, how does it change? And really the kind of phrasing that I came up with to explain it to myself and to the reader was that it flourishes at the micro level. So tiny differences between your parents' syntax in their heads and yours, assuming that, of course, that you received, your language from your parents. We, talk about your primary linguistic input, whoever that was.
Right.
And I think that that's just so key because like syntactic change stops being so abstract. It stops being this thing that we observe in historical texts, and we bring it right down to how is this actually happening? It has to be micro. Macro changes, well, crucially, especially at a young age, they will produce word orders that are noticeably different. They are divergent from your parents, what your parents are saying, and therefore you'll be corrected. That's
Right.
the crucial thing. We do this with our children. We correct our children. In doing so, it's almost like a large garden. You've got the kind of the smaller weeds growing and the big trees growing. It's the big trees that get cut down
Right.
by your parents.
Right.
Yeah. And it's the little grass that is able to flourish and to be ignored by the people. And that's crucially, I think for me, that's where the divergences across time come from. The to put it in jargon, but in I think to put it succinctly, the diachronic, so through time, is really synchronic in
Mhm.
time. Like it's yeah, there's no passage through time without snapshots of time.
Right.
So yeah, that's the way I think about these things. It's just I'm just so happy because I love my field, and it's just so nice that people are talking about this stuff these days.
Well, and I think too, it seems like, and you probably are and will continue to be part of this, syntax is being presented as a, and this is a micro change itself, but it makes a difference, is being presented as something more interesting than it was even 15 years ago. Because
Mm.
I feel like 15 years ago in grad school, the syntax classes we had to do, um, were just like, all right, you're going to sit down, you're going to read a bunch of Chomsky, and you're going to make some diagrams, you know,
Yeah.
and it's like, well, like you get some good fundamentals that way, but it's not
Yeah.
ripping. Um, and actually relating it to questions like acquisition or historical linguistics, I think that you get something much more dynamic and interesting. And also people need to know, and this is something that's not always presented well, that what is meant by generative syntax is not a single frozen thing that
Mm.
emerged perfectly conceived from the mind of Chomsky or something like that, right?
No.
It's a large conceptual framework that tolerates many different variants and different ideas and changes all the time.
Yeah.
Um, and has inspired and interacts with some other subfields in generative semantics, right?
Yeah.
Which is so tied up with syntax too in ways that I think are often underappreciated.
Yeah, and if and neurolinguistics as well. There's
Mhm.
people working with neurologists to basically, I think it's kind of it's not everything, but it is in the DNA that generative syntax, which emerges as a school of thought with Chomsky, end of the 1950s. So many of the stereotypes are kind of true but outdated. One of the stereotypes, I say stereotypes, not the right word, the impressions of the field. I have a lot of time for people who are not convinced by it. I'm describe myself as something of a reluctant generativist because I think it works, but it needs to be made to work properly. I think anyway, I won't get into that. We're not talking about generative syntax, but I mention this because it's one of the ideas is that it does make certain claims about the brain, very abstract claims, but it does make certain claims as to, even if you don't believe in universal grammar, which is fine, I don't personally, if even if you don't go for a lot of the headline ideas of generative syntax, it does still basically boil down to this external thing we do comes from in the inside, internally, right? I think that there's processing going on. That's kind
Yeah.
of the distilled essence of generative syntax. And I think it's so great that now people are having the kind of academic eagerness, academic humility, even to then go to neurologists and say, well, are we right?
Yeah.
We're making claims about the brain. Are we right? And sometimes yes, and sometimes no, which is, I think that's great. Like it's like a big jungle generative syntax, like it's or a forest. It's grown. It's really grown, and it's perhaps outgrown certain ways of thinking, which I'm very happy about.
Mhm, mhm. I appreciate everything you said just there too. And for decades and centuries, people will continue to disagree about all these questions. Is there a
Mhm.
universal grammar? Isn't there? How big is it in a sense? What does it look like? But we can
Mm.
all still uh, study these questions using much the same terminology.
Yeah, yeah,
I wanted to throw another couple questions at you from the chat. Nate
sure.
said, as a learner of modern Irish, one thing from previous interviews that has stuck with me is Dr. Baird saying, quote, old Irish is bonkers, off quote. Certainly VSO and now and then adjective sequence is less common. Did you find indications that might help explain the bonkersness?
Nate, you're just. I swear I didn't, pay you to ask me that question, but that is delightful. I am very happy to answer this question. As I mentioned briefly, Old Irish is the favorite of my favorite of the seven languages. To answer your question very quickly, yes, I did. I'm not going to claim they were particularly original. I think my contribution to the study of Old Irish was more that I was kind of repackaging it in a syntactic and a wider kind of Indo-European syntaxy framework. I have a paper published, my only academic paper published on Old Irish. With the Journal of Historical Syntax, which is freely available. It's public domain. I tried to kind of ease the reader into the syntactic side of it, but my feelings are there. So I obviously cannot agree. This is Andrew, right? Andrew Bird, talking about Old
I
Irish.
believe I believe that is the Dr.
Yeah,
Bird question, although it could be Brenna. I can believe both of them would say it, but it's
I
probably Andrew.
don't. But regardless, it's correct. Like it is, Old Irish very quickly became my favorite because it is bonkers. It is. It's bonkers in regards to one of those terms that I mentioned, 5 minutes ago. It's bonkers from a synchronic perspective. So if you take kind of the Old Irish period, that kind of chunk of time, and you compare the language in that state with, say, other Indo-European languages, my God, yes. Like it looks all over the place. So we have, as you say, this pretty rigid verb, subject, object order for most clauses, at least for kind of clauses about statements of fact. And then we have things like mutations. So that's the beginning of the consonant of the following word, no, the beginning of the following word changing to tell you something about the previous word, which is wonderful. This is, obviously still a huge part of modern Irish, modern Welsh, Breton, Cornish, and yes, I mean I use this term lovingly, but I think bonkers is a pretty fair description because of these incredible and unique phenomena that don't look very Indo-European. But from a diachronic perspective, from a historical perspective, it's extremely Indo-European. Like the scales fall from your eyes and you just are able to connect up everything. I mean, I had the privilege last year to come to America, to California, to UCLA, to co-present a paper with a very dear friend of mine. He was doing the Sanskrit side of things, and I was doing the Old Irish side of things. Sanskrit, for context, it's in India, very old, thousands of years before Old Irish. And our conclusion, which for some linguists was not particularly novel, they are one and the same.
Hmm.
Basically, Sanskrit preserves the syntax that Old Irish very reasonably developed out of. And that sense of really digging into the history of the language, it just everything made sense. So, for example, in Sanskrit, you have like a Vacanagal's law. Vacanagal's law. So your pronouns, your personal pronouns, they are moving. If they don't have an accent, if they are enclitic, they are moving for some reason to the very beginning of the clause. They are appearing in second position after the first kind of word or thing. That's Sanskrit. That's also ancient Greek. That's Avestan. That's Latin to a lesser extent. So it's pretty, safe Indo-European phenomenon. In Old Irish, that's the infixed pronouns. One of the most kind of bonkers bits of the language is just Vacanagal's law with a bit of a Old Irish flavor added onto it. Yeah, it's that sort of thing. Or for example, something like Old Irish has this incredible way of creating relative clauses. So I'm fairly confident this has not continued into modern Irish. So I think this is distinct from modern Irish. Essentially, relative clause. So like the man who I saw. You put your verb first, so saw, and then you changed to show it's a relative clause. You change the the first sound of the second component of that verb. So that could be the beginning of the verb, could be one of its kind of prefixy things. You change that. So either you add a nasal sound or you add you lenite it, so you turn it into a fricative sound. Anyway, you do something to that sound. This terrifies Old Irish learners. What on earth is going on? Where are my nice old relative pronouns that from English or Latin or Old Norse, which Old Norse just has er. Anyway, now to give an example, something like in Old Irish, do advat in fier. So gives the man gives, not a relative clause. Do nav that in ver, which the man gives. So there's a n that's been added into the verb at the very beginning. So, okay, bonkers from a synchronic perspective. Indo-European, this is Sanskrit. This is just the Sanskrit relative pronoun. This is yad or yaha, which, begins with, it begins with a y that is lost over time in Old Irish, but it used to be there. It's in kind of second position sometimes in Sanskrit. And kind of over time, what we see in Sanskrit kind of reduces and reduces and reduces, and we end up with Old Irish. So to is a very enthusiastic and very kind of long-winded answer to your question, Nate. Yes, it was the biggest pleasure I think of my academic career to work with Old Irish and to see just how powerful historical linguistics can be in making the bonkers not bonkers.
And making the bonkers intelligible anyway.
Yes.
That's a great answer. And Cameron asked, did you find any detectable relationship between syntax and the amount of inflection in a particular language? E.g., do more inflected languages have looser syntax?
Oh, Cameron, what a question. Uh, yes. Did I find it? That's a tricky one. I'm reluctant to give a kind of clear and definitive answer to that because so much of historical linguistics is we tie ourselves up in knots thinking is there a causal relationship here, or is this just coincidence? It's possible that two aspects of a language, say, as I mentioned earlier, kind of dividing a language up, it's possible that they could be just changing independently of one another. It's more than enough work to say what is happening, and it's even more work to say why it is happening. Um, I would say, on the whole, that the association does hold. I'll put money on that. I'll stick my neck out. I think the association between less morphology and less kind of specifically grammatical morphology that's giving you grammatical information, yes, it does correlate to a more inflexible word order. I think that's a pretty it's pretty hard to argue against as a point. Like we see this over and over again. I'll say correlation at least. They are going together. I will only add the, excuse me, I will only add the caveat from my perspective is that there's definitely sophisticated, complex syntactic constraints already before languages start to lose this morphology as well. And I certainly don't want to claim that this was bound to happen. I think, even though we see similar things happening across the different subfamilies, we see this, similar things happening in Germanic that also happen in Romance. I think it's, I think it's easy to say and safe to say that these changes are correlated. I'm much warier about saying that this was always going to happen across Indo-European because in some branches of the family it hasn't, but even still, I mean, it's as a pattern, it does keep repeating itself over and over again. That these languages do lose their morphology. I'm trying to think of exceptions, but there really aren't many. Armenian has pretty complex. Armenian has pretty complex nouns, cases, endings, more complex than I would say the Indo-Aryan languages. Persian, I don't know modern Persian word order. It's a really big question. I think I'm going to say yes, they correlate, and I'm not going to claim anything bigger than that because it gets really interesting and really complicated.
Yeah, I think my impression too is that syntax can become a tighter net without morphology
Hmm.
becoming more reduced.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that distinguishes modern Icelandic from Old Norse is not a whole lot of morphological simplification, but a somewhat tighter syntactic net.
Hmm.
So I think they can happen independently of one another, but maybe that there's sort of a clock that's running on both of them that tends to run at a similar pace.
Yeah, exactly. A question about, if I may, Icelandic, to add to your point, does Icelandic have verb first clauses? Not questions, but like declarative clauses.
Not normally, uh, but Old Norse does.
Does. There you
Yeah,
go. It does.
yeah.
So
I
that's a
mean,
syntactic change with no change in, barely any change in morphology.
yeah, very little. I mean, there's some like it, yeah, it depends on how uh, nitpicky you want to get. I can get nitpicky and say no, there's a fair amount, but on
Mm.
the surface, no, there's not that much morphological change.
Mhm.
So I think that's interesting, right? And
Extremely. I would love to continue working on Old Norse because I think there's more. Old Norse and English and give really good kind of ground for this exact thing of syntax changing on its own terms. Because, we have, for context, so you mentioned earlier, to expand on that, you mentioned that we have across a lot of languages, especially early Indo-European languages, we have a general sense of you put the topic first. So whatever's topical, whatever's known, whatever is known to the audience, known to you, whatever is background information, you put that first. So I just did it in that sentence. I started with I started with a very, very long kind of shifted object, and then I got onto the real point of the sentence, which is that you put it first. And this is Latin is pretty securely topic and then comment, and like what you know and what's new, what's old, what's new. This is the idea. It's a very old idea from the kind of Prague school of linguistics. And in Germanic, excluding Gothic, but in Germanic, so like Old Norse, Old English, you see a kind of syntactic. It's hard to say what's really going on, but it kind of that never goes away, but it kind of morphs into what we think of as verb second. I think the verb second, this famous Germanic phenomenon, to explain the idea that you put the verb is second. It's the second thing in the clause. So something like in German, ich lese das Buch. So I read the book. Das Buch lese ich. Or something like heute lese ich das Buch. In all those cases, lese, the verb to read, I read, is second. Very famous kind of Germanic phenomenon, which English has almost lost. And I think you can really situate that within the context of Latin, ancient Greek, Sanskrit, and really say this is the much older topic then comment structure. But why it happens, why Germanic speakers consistently thought, hey, it's a pretty good idea to start the comment with the verb, as a kind of bookmark, right? Topic first, then the verb, basically telling the audience, here's the new information. And that over time, I don't want to speak for Icelandic, but I think essentially in German, the thing preceding the verb is not necessarily topical. So it's morphing for some reason. It's really interesting how what we have in Latin becomes what we have in Norse, recognizably, but not what, like, Icelandic has gone another step further, from what I know.
Well, and Old Norse and Modern Icelandic are not consistently V2, but the continental Scandinavian languages are, right? Norwegian, Swedish, Danish do this. Could be German influence, but I mean, you already see a tendency toward it, right? I mean, in prose and Old English and Old High German, and I would even say Old Norse often tends toward it without getting there consistently. But yeah, there's some space that verb occupies in the speaker's mind, that I think you're right. It's like thinking of it as the beginning of the comment phase is interesting. But obviously it morphs after that into just being like, no, this is where verbs are, because soon you have adverbs or whatever preceding that.
If I may, I'm very much paraphrasing George Wogden here. His amazing book, which was originally his PhD thesis, which is kind of the inspiration for my whole work. He has some very interesting ideas. I don't know if they're original to him, but that essentially adverbs might be the key to this, the kind of breakdown, because it's so interesting. And this is really another great place where syntax is reaching out to other fields. In Old English, you have this fantastic narrative structure. So essentially, as I've hopefully I've tried to outline, in the older languages, you get verb second when you have a topic. So it goes topic verb. That's what verb second is in Old English, Old Norse, Old High German as well, not in the later languages, not least. And what that means is when you don't have a topic, you have verb first. The verb's still there, still occupying whatever that slot is, but you don't get a topic. And what that means is if you read something like a narrative text in Old English, something like the Old English translation of the Venerable Bede, of his history of the English-speaking peoples, what you get is this fascinating kind of narrative structure, which is an idea that syntax has taken from elsewhere, of the flow of the narrative. So it goes, I'm going to talk about a new thing, no topic. Therefore, verb first.
Mhm.
The following sentences, well, we have a topic. We know what we're talking about now. They're verb second. So you go verb first, verb second, verb second, verb second, new thing, verb first, verb second, verb second, verb second. You get this incredible kind of using word order to show the narrative flow of new thing, what I'm going to say about it. New thing, what I'm going to say about it. So, was there once a king whose name was Alfred? Alfred, the Alfred King went to fight the Vikings. Suddenly we have a verb second because we know we're talking about Alfred by this point. He's kind of the established topic.
Mhm.
And this is not what you see in the modern Germanic languages. This system seems to break down. And as far as I know, the blame is pointed on putting adverbs in that first position. So something like thar, then. So then the king, a king called Alfred came, something like that. For whatever reason, I don't want to bore you all. As you can tell, I'm very passionate about this, but
I don't think
yeah,
you're
like,
boring anyone.
okay, okay,
I mean, this
it's
is
the usual
this is
reaction.
this is what my people come for.
Okay, so I'm amongst friends. That's nice.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. But yeah, no, it's fascinating and it seems to break down. And I'd love to keep going on this. I'd love to keep researching
Well,
this.
keep.
But
Oh, okay. I was gonna say like if you want to make some more comments about it, keep going a minute.
no, no.
It's interesting because as you were saying that, I was thinking about sentences I could remember from, say, Beowulf or from the Poetic Edda. I mean, I feel like they're both in a fairly transitional period here, where honestly the Poetic Edda seems more archaic than Beowulf. Uh,
Mm,
there's a lot of V1 in the
mhm.
Poetic Edda, and you know, sometimes it seems like it's there to satisfy some kind of metrical demand, right? To get the alliterating words in the right position. But it
Yeah,
happens so much that it can't be that marked of an order.
yeah,
And you do see it in prose too. I feel like you see it a lot less in Old English. Um, and I guess that might be sort of counterbalanced by the development of that mediopassive in Old Norse, because of course sometimes those verbs can be that they can often be the kind of existential verbs, right?
mm,
So you put your like finosk, is found, exists verb at the
yeah.
beginning of a sentence, and Old Norse has an easier time doing that than English has just saying, wasgodkynning. That I think speakers feel there's something missing there, and they want to say that wasgodkynning.
Mm,
But I
yeah,
don't know. These are interesting questions, and I think there's other interesting questions these things interact with. Like, did what we think of as imperfective versus perfective marked verbs in Proto-Indo-European mean something different than we think,
yeah.
right? Because I've always thought that if modern scholarship is wrong about what I don't think modern scholarship is wrong about the endings and their distributions, but maybe they're wrong about what exactly those endings represented, that there
Mhm.
could be something uh, there that would help solve some of these problems.
Yeah. It's crying out for more work. It's
Yeah.
just, and these are really tantalizing questions that yeah, that it's been a privilege to kind of dig into, but I've barely scratched the surface, but it's just but you can paint a picture of the Indo-European family. I think that does emerge quite quickly. You can join up these languages to one another, not just in sounds and vocabulary, but also in syntax. As I said, what Latin maintains pretty well is still there in Old Norse, but it's becoming something new. Likewise, what Sanskrit preserves pretty well has been, grammaticalized into oblivion by the time we get to Old Irish.
Mhm.
But you can connect the dots. Yeah, but of course the amazing thing that this is applies across the board to sounds, to not really vocabulary, but to certainly to sounds and definitely to syntax is that the picture of kind of Proto-Indo-European that it paints is just really distinct. It's a very different language to the languages that descends from. This is kind of this weird conclusion, like it's this kind of thing that keeps historical phonologists up at night. That we've reconstructed these sounds of Proto-Indo-European, and it doesn't look like any other language in terms of sounds. And I think in terms of syntax, like I was just sitting there, I was writing, I was trying to tie up some loose ends. I was talking a little bit about subordination because it's a really thorny issue as to could Proto-Indo-European subordinate full clauses, a kind of a finite, a proper clause, a full clause. And I deliberately stayed on the fence. I said, I don't, that's beyond my remit, which is academic ease for, I don't want to talk about it. But I did say that clearly from my research, it could subordinate non-finite clauses. So it could use infinitives, participles. It could use that to express very complex things. And the picture that emerges is pretty Sanskrity, pretty Latiny, and pretty Uralic, to be honest. Like it's pretty like it's there's a language that I have a friend that I interviewed for the podcast actually who works on it's the Uralic language, a minority language spoken in Russia. And I was like, hang on, where have I heard of this syntactic structure before? Oh, it's Mari, an unrelated language of the Uralic family. Like, yeah, you just it is change, and there are so many steps that get from, say, modern Icelandic to Proto-Indo-European. But the joy is actually in seeing that you can connect it up, you can find those steps. So, yeah,
Right. And by the way, I feel like we're high school students and I'm behind the bleachers about to offer you a tenth of marijuana I'm trying to sell you or something. But um, this is how I have become really intrigued, and this is dangerous waters with the work that Juliet Blevins has done, possibly connecting Indo-European to Basque,
yeah,
and
okay, go on.
and her work actually suggests a pretty economical explanation for why Proto-Indo-European has such a weird phonological inventory, by comparison with Basque, which she suggests is a ancient cousin of Proto-Indo-European. She's like, I know, like macro language family stuff is something people treat with a lot of gloves, but it's very interesting. And she's actually going to be on Zoom Sunday.
Mhm.
If you'd like to come to that, certainly welcome to come.
Thank you.
Um, I can send you the link.
Please
But
do. Yeah.
her work is actually really impressive. She's like, regardless of whether she's right or not, she's done it the right way,
Mm.
right? And she's not suggesting some kind of like, I mean, she has learned so much about Basque and like a lifetime's worth of Basque work, but she's not suggesting, oh, this explains all the questions one could have about either language family by reference to the other. But it's surprising how economically the two work and how many
Mm.
cognates you can set up once you get some basic sound correspondences established. So I've been pretty surprised, pretty impressed with that. So Tony Yates at UCLA, who you might have met when you were
I
there.
have, yes, a couple of times. Yeah, lovely guy.
Yeah, so he and Luke Gordon and I are going to interview her on Sunday. So you're welcome to come.
Thank you. No, truly,
remind me
thank
if
you. I
I.
mean, but like again, this is completely new to me, so I'm speaking from ignorance. That doesn't sound impossible, but as you say, it just needs to be done the right way.
Yeah,
If we have a language that is very distantly related, where the kind of common point of origin has serious time depth, then of course it's going to be different. Of course, it's
yeah,
going to look very, very different as Basque does. Okay, fine. Basque is ergative, has an ergative structure, but Kurdish, Hindi, Urdu,
sure,
classic,
sure.
Indo-European languages, they have ergativity or some ergativity as well. So I would love to join. Sounds great.
Sure. Well, and like I said, I feel like I'm offering you drugs behind the bleachers because of the way that, these things are usually treated in academic settings. It's like impossible. You can't talk about this stuff. But if someone does it right and responsibly, I really don't mind. And I think she did it amazingly responsibly. So again, even if she's wrong, she didn't do it the wrong way.
Yeah.
Um, anyway, off topic, but I thought I should mention that to you. Um, and just we should probably work toward wrapping this topic
Of
up.
course, of
But
course.
one thing that I think is going to be really fascinating too is getting more information built into this model from Anatolian languages,
Right.
because the differences, I think that one of the most surprising things is how different they are. You get those clitic chains, which kind of look like
Mhm.
Vedic but
Yeah.
like the way that it works in Anatolian is pretty different. Um, why? Why is that different? What is the time depth between the split of Anatolian from the other Indo-European languages? Is it further back than people think? I mean, sometimes it looks pretty far.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I think that those are interesting questions to ask.
Yeah, if I may, I could not agree more. And I actually, the final line of the conclusion to my thesis is that this is a natural avenue. I haven't included it for purely for personal reasons. Like it is a language that I've taught myself to some level of proficiency in these languages,
Sure.
and Hittite was just that, a language too far. But I will say I've had a lot of conversations about Hittite, some of which with Tony Yates,
Okay.
and I will only say that the time depth doesn't bother me so much.
Hmm.
It's the question of, is this innovation or is this
Right, right,
conservation?
right.
That's what bothered me. So, like, say I mentioned earlier, Hittite's pretty. I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say it doesn't have WH movement. It looks the WH word stays very close to the verb, which I think is very cool. I have an explanation for why that is, but nonetheless, is that new? Did the
Right.
Hittites start doing it like the French? Did they used to have it? Or is this conservative? Is this the way that Proto-Indo-European used to be?
Yeah.
That question, without a kind of a long time depth where you could build up a picture of this is conservative language, this is innovative language, that would be a massive hurdle, I think, if I were to expand it to Hittite.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and
Cool.
I mean, knife to my throat when I say that you've moved from a Sanskrit situation to a Hittite situation or a Hittite situation to a Sanskrit situation. I would say you
Mhm.
moved from Sanskrit to Hittite. Like I can motivate that change more,
Mhm. Mhm.
but is that just because I'm prejudiced toward a Sanskrit-like structure because that's more classically Indo-European and that's kind of what I'm used to?
Mm.
I don't know.
Absolutely. It all just becomes, yeah, compete. It just weighing up the alternatives. As you said with, Blevin's work on Basque, just doing it right,
Mm,
being honest,
yeah.
weighing up the options, considering both, considering, dangerous ideas as well as, orthodox ideas. And yeah, you could make some headway. I personally think that Hittite is, in this regard at least, I think it might be conservative. I think it might be
Mm,
old.
interesting.
I think it's yeah, but then again, a whole other family of languages that I talked about even less in this PhD project was Tocharian, which I know
Mm,
even less about. But I had a wonderful conversation on the route to the restaurant, the conference dinner in UCLA with this amazing scholar who studies Tocharian, and I had the same question
cool.
rolling around in my head. It's Onishi. Onishi, I couldn't hazard a guess at his age, but still a PhD student. Works on Tocharian.
Oh, I was
I
going to
think
say
he's
this, is,
finished.
this isn't one of the two Tokarianists I know.
Yes, yeah, he makes the third that I know as well. Lovely guy. I apologize if I've got his name wrong. But he was talking about like Bacchanagle's law in Tocharian, how it's not there. Is that old? Is
Hmm.
that new? I
Hmm.
don't know.
Hmm.
Anyway,
Hmm.
food for thought. And if I stay in
Well,
academia, if academia will have me, then I will dedicate my life and you can call me back in 50 years' time and I'll let you know what I've found.
oh, okay. I mean, I think you're more likely to be here in 50 years than I am. Uh, but Tokarian is so young in a way. Like we forget how young Tokarian is.
Mm,
As split as far back as it probably is split from Indo-European, it's still a pretty young attestation. Like
yeah.
I don't know that I would necessarily count on syntactic features there to be particularly old.
Mm. But
But
then Tocharian also is its own kind of linguistic area. So Tocharian is in
yeah,
touch with sort of, Sino-Tibetan languages.
yeah.
Fun fact, if I may, you probably know this, but for people who don't, Tocharian, I think is Tocharian. It's Tocharian A or B. I think it's Tocharian A. It's the only Indo-European language to have a split first-person pronoun according to gender, as male and female. I love that. Fun fact.
Yeah, yeah, which
Yep.
is weird.
Very,
I
very
mean,
weird.
because even Hebrew doesn't do that, and Hebrew has a lot of split gender stuff.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yep. Great stuff. But yeah, that could be, I mean, pronouns in Sino-Tibetan languages are pretty, I would say it's a kind of a more open category. I'm getting
Mm.
into languages I don't know so much about, but they can be remarkably innovative
Mhm.
with their pronouns. And maybe this is a contact feature.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, just
And
like
you end up,
Lithuanian has contact cases from Uralic.
there you go. And you end up going round and round and just having a wonderful time, but not actually concluding anything.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Well, that there's a segue there for you because I did want to talk to you a little bit about your podcast.
Hard melt him in moder, hat mir skilde kaupa.
You are a man clearly passionate about languages,
Yeah.
and your new podcast is A Language I Love Is. So tell us a little bit about what inspired the podcast, what you're looking to do with the podcast. You know, uh,
Oh,
give us
thank you.
the what and why.
With pleasure. I must stress that it's very much a passion project. You know, the host, sound engineer, and producer of the podcast are all the same person.
Familiar with that
Well,
model?
yeah, no doubt you are. It does not have the audio, certainly doesn't have the video quality, and definitely doesn't have the audio quality of what you produce. I
This is audio
suppose
quality.
it's
Tell
no.
that
Your
tell
I
that to
said
the
this last
commenters.
time. I said this, your videos are so good. Crystal clear quality. It's like you're in the room. It's like I'm in the Rockies with you,
Tell
you
that to
know?
the commenters, man.
Really? Okay. That's yeah, I'm feel right feels unjust. Because I'm always very impressed by what motivated it? You motivated it, the podcast. The last time we spoke a year and a half ago, you very kindly invited me to join this elite Zoom call with you, Luke Ranieri, and Simon Roper, which was awesome. Like the people that I have playing out of my phone most days are just kind of talking to them.
It was
And
a
we just
fun
got talking. Yeah.
conversation. This is a little bit this is before we talked publicly because this was a private Zoom call.
I think it was after we recorded because it was very late. I remember that much, and I was interested but sleepy.
I feel like it was before maybe. I don't know. It doesn't matter. But for the record, this was not recorded. Anyone who
No,
was
no,
looking for
no.
this dream team featuring Ronnie Arias, Simon Roper, and Danny in one place. It was just a conversation we sort of had about like, was Andrew Mark Henry there?
About what? Sorry.
Was Andrew Mark Henry there?
No, no. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was potential, and yeah, he was missed by me because I love religion for breakfast. That's his, right? Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
wonderful stuff.
Yeah, but we talked quite a bit about sort of, well, it was it felt like an almost Homeric scene, it was the Nestors of online language, social media stuff, talking to the young hero about to storm the walls of Troy. Like, here's the
Yeah.
things to keep in mind.
It was hugely appreciated. It was great advice. I have to. I will say this: like, I loved that conversation. It really got me fired up. But I mentioned at the time that I do think that of the different available platforms, I do think that video is the one with the highest hurdles to cross. Not saying I could start recording myself right now. We are recording, but I do think that quality of audio, quality of video signals quality of content. Signals doesn't necessarily equal, but signals to the consumer. And
Sure.
I've tried with video, and it just looks rubbish. It looks really. I've tried it, so I was thinking, well, what can I do? Which is audio. I have a microphone. I already do voice work. By the way, I don't know if I mentioned that at the time. Like I do a little bit of professional voice work. If you take any exams in a certain Central European country in English, that's my voice, which is great
That's
fun.
fun. Huh.
It's good. It's great fun. Yeah, wonderful, really, really great stuff. But I suppose the inspiration for the podcast was firstly that I desperately wanted to join you guys in just doing something that wasn't Twitter, and Twitter hasn't been doing so well. I think it's lost a certain vibrancy that it used to have. And I really wanted to kind of expand, kind of add a second string to my bow. So that was one reason. But the reason for the format specifically, which I came up with years ago, and I just sat on it, it was 2020 that I first kind of typed this idea out, is that I realized that I am someone who is deeply paranoid about getting the facts right. I will research a short tweet incessantly. I will just research and research and research until I've kind of justified to myself that even if I'm not right, then at least I've done my work. And I mention this because I thought that there are amazing linguistics podcasts out there, something like Lingthusiasm, for example, which is awesome. I could not do that. They put the burden of research on themselves. They're good. They get it right. I just, if I came up with that kind of podcast format, I'd never say anything at all because I'd be so kind of terrified about getting something wrong. So I came up with this idea. A language I love is essentially, it's not about me. It's about one language per episode and one person who loves that language. So every episode I have a guest. They have tended so far to be academic linguists, so linguists who are within academia, but it's not an academic linguist, a language that an academic linguist love. It's a language I love. So it's open to a group of people. I've had undergraduate students. I've had a translator, recently a professional translator. And we're 22 episodes now. Still very much a passion project. Still, if you give it a listen, I beg your patience with the audio quality. I am learning still. And it's been awesome. It's been so much fun to just have these conversations with, 22 or 23. There was a double billing, but 23 passionate linguists and just to, create something special. I've loved it. And it's on a little bit of hiatus at the moment. I'm on a second series. And what that means is that I've kind of run out of friends that I could pressure into being the guest. So now that I'm on the second series, I'm now going to friends of friends and contacts, and what that means is I'm contacting people who don't have as much time. But nonetheless, the last episode was on Romansh, so the smallest language of Switzerland, which was great. I learned a lot. I always learn a lot listening to these people. The language before that was Purépecha, which is a language isolate of Mexico. The language before that was Biblical Hebrew, which was Benjamin Suchard, who was on Religion for Breakfast. He's wonderful, very knowledgeable. Coming up, I think we've got one guy who has agreed to do classical Chinese, somebody who has agreed to do an Algonquian language, hasn't specified which yet, which will be completely terra nova for me. Yeah. And who else? One person. I'm trying my best. There's one person. This is the one I'm particularly passionate about. I shouldn't have, favorites, but I've got one guy who has provisionally agreed to do an episode on Pictish.
Ooh,
which
wow.
I
mean, I can tell you what I know about Pictish in 15 seconds, so that's particularly interesting. Or the Algonquian is interesting. I've done a little bit of work, not for any real academic purpose, with Arapaho, which is a pretty outlying Algonquian language. So that should be pretty interesting, no matter what language.
Should be great. Wow. These are amazing people talking about amazing languages. It's worked better than I ever could have hoped for, truly. But we'll see where it goes, because it's all dependent on people having time, people giving up their time. I can't pay my guests, it's very much a passion project. But I will say this as a final comment. I feel there's space on the market, like for linguistic podcasts. Like, podcasts are massive these days. Language ones, there's not many. And
Yeah.
there's fewer, and I don't want to gatekeep here, but there's fewer that I would call linguistics. And when I say linguistics, I don't mean like, I have the power to say, you are linguistics, you are
No,
not,
no.
but just language for language's sake. There's a lot of ones on English, for example, a lot of ones which are language specific, a lot of ones that talk about, writing styles, a lot of ones that talk about lexicography. That's linguistics, I suppose. But I think if you have an idea for a language podcast, please give it a go, and I will definitely listen to it because yeah.
Well, and I was going to tell you, I don't know if this is exactly your content, but I think that, I can share with you this audio file, and this might be a decent episode to put on there. It's not exactly the format because you're not talking about one language, but it's
Oh,
a
yeah.
nice, I think you did a really good job talking about your dissertation work and your, interest in historical syntax. It might be something to throw up there as an episode.
I said I'd not considered that. As long as I'm not stepping on your toes.
Oh, there's no, I, what,
Oh.
what toes, like I, I don't mind. And like, I'm still very honored by the invitation to do one. This is a place where, my own depression is an enemy, right? I just like it's a difficult thing for me to say.
Mm.
I love language right now. So
Yeah.
I have to be in a different headspace to talk about that. Like I've been in that mood where I could have that discussion, but I like, oh boy, it seems just something about phrasing it that way. I feel like what you would get would be way more glum than what you want.
Yeah.
So
I understand. Yeah.
so I have to think about like how exactly or like you said, maybe do something like completely off the wall. But I don't know about it. I don't know that I know enough about something like Arapaho or Shoshone to give you a really good linguistics episode about it. Although I've taken some interest in those languages from the neighborhood.
Sure.
Have you had? Am I crazy, or have you not had Ronnie Airy on yet?
No, no. He very kindly expressed an interest, but yeah, we haven't agreed on anything.
Because that would be a barn burner,
Yeah, it would be. It would be
right?
good.
I mean,
It would be
you
really
and him
good.
talking about Latin, God, that would just blow the doors off. Um, so, and I think I have a few more people I could suggest to you that I think would be really good, who can give you a nice précis about one language or another, and really, really talk to you about just about every aspect of it that you would want to hear about. Um,
Yeah.
I've been thinking about who to suggest for something like modern Icelandic, because I know some people who could probably give you some really good talks about that. Um,
Great.
Oddly enough, maybe this is too inside baseball for this public conversation. I was talking to a candidate for president in Iceland. They're about to have their election, and
Right.
this is the kind of power I wield. Um, but he's actually a very passionate scholar of modern Icelandic with a lot of um, interesting impressions about it and its
Mhm.
present and future, which I thought maybe that would be a really interesting person for you to talk to, especially if he becomes president.
Mm.
Because how many heads of
Um,
state have you had, right?
none, I have to say. A bit lacking in that department. Yeah. That's an amazing idea. And it makes me very happy that we can have a linguist head of state. That's yeah,
I don't know if
good
he's a
stuff.
linguist by training exactly. I mean, the current president is a professor of history.
Wonderful. Yeah. I presume that everybody knows these people. Like Iceland can be quite a small place,
Iceland's a
right?
very small country, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But
Amazing.
anyway, I it's a
No,
fun project, and I think that what's great too is that, as you said, the ecosystem of language podcasts tends toward, and it's not to be again gatekeeping or excessively judgmental, but it's just for slightly predictable directions and not very technical directions. But
yeah.
you can have a technical discussion that's also very interesting,
Yes. I like to think so.
right?
Yeah.
And I think as you do push the envelope of who you're inviting to talk, you're going to get more and more just completely off the shelf, and not off the shelf, like off of the shelf of predictability languages. Like there's only so much.
Mm.
Everybody's heard a little bit about the history of English or French or something. It's like, let's talk about something you haven't really heard about, like let's get some African languages on here and, really,
Yeah.
really talk about like some structures and some history that you really haven't heard. Um, I think that
Mm.
that'll be great. So I look forward to more of this.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the endorsement and for giving it the airspace. Like I said, it's just all very small, but it's been wonderful. It's been really great to work on this, and just I couldn't agree more. I need to be careful of my words. To quote another meme, if I speak, I am in trouble. It's popular linguistics is doing well. I'll say that. I think it
Makes
could be
sense.
doing better.
Mhm.
I think what you and Luke do is awesome. I think in terms of, I would say in all the different kind of media outlets, and I'm including, print media, visual media, I would say that YouTube for me feels like the one that's the best, where you're getting fresh information, good information, you're getting good linguistics. And other types of media are just lagging behind.
Mhm.
Especially like America, I would say is better than the UK in this. I think I've talked to book publishers about this, and Americans are, in general, the American book market is more open to new ideas, ideas that are not kind of light and fluffy ideas. In the UK, the bookshops are just, it's safe. It's safe, read these word facts, condensed history of English, and I just
Mhm.
think that we can push the boat out in all formats. And linguistics is doing well. I think it's having a bit of a golden age. I don't think we've reached the apex of the golden age yet, though. I think that yeah, I think there's more work to be done, pushing it in more directions, more popular linguistics, more avenues, and I'd like to contribute to that. So yeah.
Well, and I think you're an excellent person to contribute to it. You're already contributing a lot to it. And one of the hardest things to do that you are already learning also is that, you're trying to do good work by your audience. You're trying to cultivate an audience that has your trust, that knows that you're going to present good information, that you're not just, you know, spitting whatever
Mm,
weird impressions come off the top of your head. And then the the media moves out from under you, right? I mean, you've been doing Twitter for so long,
mm.
and then Twitter just starts sliding. I'm not sure, but what YouTube is kind of sliding right now, partially just because they're trying to push everything toward shorts and toward, um, like 10 marketable topics that everything is trying to um, circle around. It may be that in
Yeah,
10 years,
yeah,
none of these media per se are still around, right? Like uh, there may not be a
yeah.
YouTube, there may not be a Twitter, there may not be a Spotify. And part of what you, I think, are doing well amidst that is you're saying, well, I'm going to keep up with this mission where I am engaging, and that
Mm,
mission may change. How exactly, what medium exactly I'm using. And I think that it's
mm,
great that as Twitter has eroded, I think that's fair to say, as a medium, you didn't move to like what's the next what's the thing that's most like Twitter, right? Like you took a really different step with a podcast. I think
yeah, it's
it's,
blue sky or threads. Yeah,
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 right. And I like
yeah.
that. I think
I,
that
I, well, I'll do my best to. Yeah.
yeah, I think it's a really good move. I mean, personally, I'm considering moving
Mhm.
to interpretive dance on the streets um once once YouTube is just gone. But
Oh, yes, I saw. I did see your what was it? Your year in review, which was on the kind of in a gray area between confession and parody, where like you were. You know the video I mean?
trying to remember, like, gray area between confession and parody, that's like one video and eight for me.
Oh, okay. Yeah. The one that involved you shouting through a megaphone.
Oh yeah, the April
That
Fool's
one.
thing, yeah. Oh man. I thought it was pretty funny
April
because people
Fools.
can,
It was April Fools.
yeah,
That's it.
because people complain about my volume, right? It was fun. I still got the megaphone.
Hmm.
Still have the costume. Maybe one or both will come back.
Okay. I enjoyed it, but there was depth to what you were saying, and I completely understand that you've I don't know what the right metaphor is. You've tied yourself to the mast. No, you haven't, but it's difficult to let go. But the mission exists at the mercy of the environment of the platform,
Yeah.
and I've made no secret of the fact that the kind of decline of Twitter, the erosion of Twitter, which I don't think I've ever got hysterical about it. I don't think I've tried to be a kind of doomsayer, but
Oh,
I think the experience has got worse and the interaction has decreased as a result. I can give concrete examples of, not just anecdotal, but like, what I mean. But I make no secret of the fact that it's heartbreaking.
yeah.
Like it's really it really got to me sometimes. Not only the content, but the connections
Yeah.
that that
And it
I've
would have
made.
happened.
It's tough.
It would have happened sooner or later. Like these things never don't last
Mm.
forever, right? But it was sad to
Hmm.
watch. I mean, it did feel pretty sudden with Twitter. YouTube, I feel like could still turn
Hmm.
around a little bit, and partially too. It's like I'm not trying to blame YouTube from, like me, right? Like obviously, I'm going to make things that are going to be more or less interesting to my audience, but YouTube definitely
Hmm.
is trying to be something that like it's like it got good at being YouTube, and now it's trying not to be YouTube. You know what I mean? Like I feel like maybe something like that is what happened to Twitter
I
too.
like that.
There's a question here in the
Hmm.
chat if you have a moment.
Oh, yes.
Viavoshi says, I
Yeah,
missed most of
go
the
ahead.
interview, so no idea what you discussed earlier, but a question regarding historical syntax. Have you done anything with diachronic construction grammar? If so, what do you think of it? Um, like, what do you think of this another theory of language beyond
Ah,
framework?
that's a great question. No, that's a fantastic question. How do I answer the question accurately? Yes and no. That's what I would say. I make no secret of the fact that the generative methodology to historical syntax is only one methodology. I do my best if anything, as a kind of olive branch to other ways of doing syntax. I mentioned that from the get-go in the thesis that this is the method that I have chosen for two related reasons. Firstly, because I think George Walkden in his 2014 book gives a very nice kind of clear methodology, kind of for clarity's sake. He gives a way to proceed with the whole business of reconstructing syntax. So that kind of methodology was already there. I read his book. I loved his book. I told him I loved his book. And also, the reason why I've chosen to follow this is because I do believe that it does, as I said earlier, kind of get syntactic reconstruction up to the level of traditional lexical phonological reconstruction. I think it zooms in on these kind of nice concrete atoms that we can say are being passed down the generations in a chain of acquisition. That's not the question. That's just a prologue. Um, the reason why I say no is because I do know people who work with diachronic construction grammar. It absolutely exists, and I think it works very nicely. There is one book, not book, there's one paper by a whole load of authors. It's like 4 or 5 authors, and the first name is an Icelandic name, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. And it's excellent. Personally, there's not a hint of Chomsky in sight. I think it works beautifully as a way of doing it. The reason why me and my friend Krishnan, my collaborator, my academic collaborator, the reasons why we are hesitant to adopt it as our own is that we think that it has a couple of methodological problems to work out. So sort of kind of kinks to iron out still, in that it relies on constructions and it works through some pretty concrete constructions. So the one in this paper I mentioned is the idea of a woe. So woe to you, woe plus dative or genitive, which is something that you find across Indo-European languages. And it's the idea that this kind of nice construction, the word for woe, meaning, alas, poor me, plus the kind of a dative experiencer of the woe, of the misfortune, is a nice construction that I think we can reconstruct back to some sort of very early stage, regardless of the etymology of woe, which is very complex. But the problem is that that is a safe construction. What else in syntax can be said to be one construction? Like that's it's all idea. Well, I think that the generative approach gives you these nice kind of comparanda, these things that you can say this equals this in another language. They share what George Walton calls diachronic identity, so they are the same, connected through time. And I think that construction grammar has yet to match that methodologically, in that it hasn't yet kind of provided a cogent definition of what a construction is, how complex is it, how, what is the role of innovation, what is conservative, what is being passed on. I think it works, but I think there's a little bit more kind of theoretical work to be done to open it up as an alternative avenue to reconstructing some syntax. So yeah, big thumbs up from me, but not personally what I do.
I think it's a great answer.
Thank you.
Other questions related to historical syntax or podcasting about language? It's been a great conversation. And like I said, I'll share the audio file with you so that you can do.
Thank you.
You can post it if you'd like.
Thank you very much. Will this make it onto YouTube?
Yep.
Oh, okay, great, cool.
Yep.
That's fine.
If it doesn't step on your toes for it to be in both places. I figure,
yeah,
as much as the much dreaded algorithm pushes against any particular thing being shared, sharing it more than one place is never a big deal.
It's like that, is it? Yeah, that makes sense. It's like the fact that it's not made for YouTube specifically, it recognizes that. That's depressing. Yeah. But still, no, please do. I mean, I have very little presence on YouTube. I have our previous conversation, which was great. I also have a collaboration which I'd love to do a shout out for, if I may, collaboration with a very talented animator, Will, and we did a kind of fun animation history of English.
Cool.
It's called, if you're interested, his channel is called Learn with Will, and you'll know his work, but you might not know his channel. He does work for other YouTubers, and that was a blast. So like animated me speaking Middle English and Old English, and it was great. So yeah,
okay, that's pretty fun. Yeah, cool.
It's aimed at sort of a high school age audience in general, just kind of introducing bits of etymology. It's great fun. So yeah, I love YouTube. I can't get enough of it, but I'm not really on it.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, one's taste for different venues changes over time. I doubt that I could do. I mean, my good friend Luke Gordon at the University of New Mexico has constantly tried to work on me to do like a real podcast with him. And for me, I just find podcasting to be a bigger lift than YouTube.
Interesting. Why'd you say that?
Signing up for these like RSS feeds and getting whatever host, and it's more complicated than just having a smartphone and filming yourself and throwing that up on YouTube. I think.
Fair enough. No, I can't argue with that, to be honest.
Plus, I like the excuse that I have built in for myself that I get to go outside to neat places and film there.
You do, yes. I think, yeah, those backgrounds, my God, incredible backgrounds. But you don't need to have a good background. Think of, our aforementioned colleague, Simon, who films in his garden, which is just also delightful.
Yeah, his garden is charming. I mean,
yeah.
So everybody does different things, and I mean, some really successful YouTubers just sit in the basement and shout at you. So. Obviously different things work for different people, but I have decided that my shtick, for however long it lasts, is I go into the mountains and I talk to people. So
it works. It works for me. I love it.
Yeah.
I watch all of them, and I always learn something, because, and I will say this, it has a great reception among linguists, historical linguists. I know all the people I've mentioned also watch your videos.
Really?
They
Okay.
all do, and especially there is one thing that may that kind of a comment, definitely speaking for myself, is that especially when you do historical linguistics, you can quite quickly lose sight of the culture and the history. You know,
Hmm.
you've spent all day looking for a verb. You forget who said that verb and why they said it. So all the videos on the background to the Old Norse language, like I know the language fairly well, but the philology, the history, I'm just, yeah, keep it coming.
Thanks. Well, I mean, thanks in large part to people like you who come on and give interviews about topics that, I know much less about. I hope to keep doing that.
Okay.
And
Well,
well,
yeah.
so for now, I'm going to say thank you for taking all this time for us. Thanks for a great interview, and hope to talk to you again for long. Danny Bate, Patreon. All the
Thank you
best.
so much. And thank you so much, if I may. And also thank you, Cameron, for suggesting this. Truly. Thank you very much
Yes,
for
thank you very much.
fighting in my corner. Much appreciated. And thank you so much till the next time, whenever that may be.
Hopefully soon. All the best
Yeah.
for now.
Okay. Bye everyone. Bye.